Welcome to this edition of Rattling the Bars. I'm your host, Man Smooza. The U.S. military prison at Guantanamo Bay continues to be a stain on our humanity and what we call our civilization. A state-sanctioned black ops site where human rights functionally don't exist, where torture is routine. Amnesty International called Guantanamo Bay the gulag of our time. Now imagine if you had somehow survived the horrors of Guantanamo Bay as a political prisoner, only to find yourself dumped on the side of a road in a country you don't know, no identification papers, no passport, no money, no way to contact or see your family, no legal existence. In a recent report for the Intercept, where she, the photo editor, journalist Elise Swain, wrote, "Life behind Guantanamo Bay for some men is just another Guantanamo Bay. Those who cannot be repatriated are instead sent to a third country, like Kazakhstan, where former detainees have been met with more arbitrary detention." To talk about this, we're joined today by Elise Swain. Welcome to Rattling the Bars, Elise.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start by making sure listeners know what's happening to these prisoners at Guantanamo Bay being released into foreign countries.
Right. So we have a situation, at Guantanamo Bay for the last 20 years where 700 men, 779 men came in and were either released or, the few remaining 30 are still there today. And so what happened with a lot of these men, hundreds of them were Yemeni, men from Yemen, and the political situation in Yemen had deteriorated. The government was non-existent, the country was in a civil war. And so when the United States government, couldn't prosecute and had no evidence to charge and continue to detain these, prisoner of law, unconstitutionally held men, they had to release them. And so what ended up happening was they were not able to return to places like Yemen because that, was deemed too unstable, and the United States was worried about, the security of the United States, and if these men were to, re-engage with terrorism and extremism. And so what they ended up doing was, creating these third country resettlement deals. And so that is what I'm interested in my reporting that I've been doing lately for the Intercept. So we're talking specifically about countries now where this has gone very wrong. There are many successful resettlement stories, where men have been able to essentially live normal lives, work, travel, get married, obtain their documents. But what I'm interested in, in talking about today is the issues that we're seeing play out, in places like Kazakhstan, the United Arab Emirates, where these men are lacking fundamental, basic human rights.
Right.
So let's get into all of that.
You spent a lot of time reporting on the story of Sabri Al Karishi. Tell us about Sabri and what it's been like to talk to him directly.
Yeah, so Sabri's become a friend. Sabri is an amazing person. I'm really lucky to call him a friend at this point. He's one of the kindest, most caring, considerate, funny people that I've spoken to. His native language is Arabic. He was dumped in Kazakhstan, 9 years ago, where they speak Kazakh and Russian. So, he's had to learn English, and now Russian. And so he's sort of caught between these three different languages. But as we spent months kind of speaking, his English did get better. And, we did some reporting from Arabic to English. And, I was able to really understand and tell his story for the first time, because a lot of these men, I mean, like I said, there were 770 of them. A lot of these stories never got told.
Right.
And so Sabri, spent 12 years at Guantanamo. He was not one of the black site prisoners. He was deemed, low intelligence value, because he was picked up in Pakistan, where he was working, with merchandise. He was there for a perfume factory,
Right.
Buying wholesale things, trying to make money, trying to be a rich man, and make his family proud. And he was young, and he just happened to be there at this time where 9/11 had just happened, and they were dumping leaflets, offering bounty money up to $5,000.
Right.
And warlords, across Pakistan and in Afghanistan were selling people to the United States government for money. This happened with up to 86% of the men that were at Guantanamo Bay. And so, unable to return to Yemen after Guantanamo, Sabri was pretty, enthusiastic and was looking forward to being offered a life in Kazakhstan. It's a Muslim country. He was told that he would be living, under some restrictions for the first 2 years, but essentially he was going there as a free man. He would have all the same rights as Kazakh citizens. He was told he would be treated as a member of society. And for the last 8 years, he has found himself without the most basic needs being met. He said to me, truly my life now is just as bad as it was when I was in Guantanamo, and in many aspects, even worse. At least there, I knew I was in prison and that I would at least get out one day. So now he's essentially living in an open air prison where he's being told that he's free, and he's living in what I would consider, the complete opposite of freedom. His movements are monitored. People are actively discouraged from talking to him, of being friends with him. They become monitored. He's kept mostly, in isolation because of this, because of the stigma of being branded a terrorist in Kazakhstan. He does not have ID. He does not have asylum. He is stateless, living in this country. He is unable to receive money or mail. He can't drive. He cannot travel. And the International Committee of the Red Cross is the one that pays for him to have an apartment and live there. He is getting no support from the actual Kazakh government.
What does Sabri's situation say about other former Guantanamo Bay detainees are going through? And why are they going to countries like Kazakhstan?
So all of this, these resettlement deals are run out of an office at the State Department. So we have a diplomatic branch of the government, taking over and trying to clean up the mess that was made post 9/11, with Guantanamo Bay and the mess of the CIA and all of the torture that occurred there. So essentially now, with the State Department, an office within the State Department, first created under Obama to transfer these men out of Guantanamo during the days where in the Obama administration, they wanted to close Guantanamo. That was a priority. Of course, then Trump came in and disbanded this office at the State Department, stopped any transfers out of Guantanamo Bay, made men who were cleared for release just sit there and wait for 4 more years until they were able to leave.
Right.
And so, they're ending up, people like Sabri, and Mohammed, the 2 remaining today in Kazakhstan, are ending up in places like that because they're essentially pawns in a geopolitical game. What the State Department is doing, is using diplomacy to try to place these men in countries that are unwilling hosts. So no one wants to be responsible for men that the United States have, said were the worst of the worst, terrorist extremists, people who killed innocent civilian life, and did war crimes. Of course, we have a very, very small percentage of men remaining in Guantanamo today that they ever actually were able to bring evidence against that they were involved in a war crime against the United States. most of these men, were unchargeable,
Right, right.
but did the time for it anyway. Okay, so no one wants to be responsible for them, but some countries are accepting them in these deals with the State Department because either it strengthens their relationship with the United States. There's a quid pro quo here. Maybe it gets benefits for them, in some ways later on down the road, or they're just being paid to take them in. I have heard that. Not in all cases, but in some cases, these we are literally paying countries to take these men off of our hands. Okay, so it shows real neglect of the United States to have any thoughtful policy in place for what to do with these men. Once they were able to be released. What has happened here with this resettlement situation, or even for the men that go back home to their native countries, there is no exoneration for them. They're not leaving Guantanamo, with a pat on the back and a handshake saying, we're so sorry for what we did to you. Here's reparations. Here's compensation. Here's rehabilitation for what you went through, for the arbitrary detention that amounts to torture. For some of the men, they did go through the black site interrogation program. For the other men, there was military run torture. Okay, we had two different parts of the government torturing, interrogations that went beyond any reasonable, stress, what they call, stress positions, enhanced interrogation. I mean, no, it's torture. What the CIA did and what the US government did at Guantanamo and beyond was torture. And there has been no meaningful accountability for what was done to those men, and there has been no prosecution for those who committed it. And so for now, these men to be released from Guantanamo just to be tied up in more decades of bureaucratic nonsense, where they are left with no rights, and the State Department says, about the situation in Kazakhstan, listen, it's not a priority right now. His life isn't in danger, so he's just going to continue to live at the margins of society. And that's what, we have now. It is a diplomatic quagmire where these men have been tied up for decades in legal, messes that the United States itself created by handing them over to another country and not meaningfully following up, having no meaningful follow up with the diplomacy deal that was done. What happens after the 2 years, United States couldn't care less. Okay. So unless these men advocate for themselves, unless they talk to the media, unless they write a book or go on social media and become activists, these men are remaining nameless victims of the war on terror, and they are living in the margins of society, and they are impoverished, willfully so, because they are not allowed to work and they have not been exonerated, and they are broken.
You cited in your article about the UN investigation into Guantanamo Bay, right? And you basically said that it really didn't really reveal nothing that was not already known, and that in reality it was a bit too late to help people like Sabri. And more importantly, unpack in your investigation, did they conclude that reparations should be given to men like Sabri?
This report from the Special Rapporteur on human rights for the United Nations was significant in many ways. First, this was the first independent investigator from the UN to be able to have full access and full cooperation from the United States to go into the actual prison. She was able to interview, the men that were still held there. She talked to men who have been released. I know for a fact she spoke with Sabri and with Mansour Adaifi and others who have been released. for this investigation. So really, this is a critical understanding, and so much of this we've been missing because the media has not been allowed to do their jobs. We are not allowed to speak to these men. They are held incommunicado, and they always will be because they were victims of CIA torture. And so the more that they can control that narrative, the more that they can turn, the United States public, make sure that we continue to turn a blind eye to the horrifying international human rights abuses that were committed in our name, the better. And so what this report to me meant, was a reaffirmation that the core of the problem here is this arbitrariness. There's this inexplicable, indefinite detention, that is just never ending. And because of lack of public interest, because of lack of media turning, its spotlight on to this situation, we have allowed a situation where, as the UN Special Rapporteur writes, life beyond Guantanamo for some men is just another Guantanamo. And it's all of these reasons, that I've just mentioned, that this is the case. If there was public interest, if the narrative had changed, oh my God, look at what we've done. These men were all largely not involved in 9/11 or in the USS Cole bombing. These men were not involved in active, violent plots against the United States. They were just living their lives. Some of them, yes, of course, they were training, with Al Qaeda or the Taliban, but that's just part of the culture, and we had no understanding of why they were really there. That wasn't the crime. The crime was, war crimes against the United States. And so, but the United States never, never admitted fault, never said all of these men, were innocent in the way that our own criminal justice system would define innocence.
Right.
So what happens is that, we now have a neglectful media that is not covering this in the same way. And we have, this report, published 20 years too late.
Right.
And what do we,
exactly.
What do we do about it now? I mean, all of this is already, in progress. All of the, bureaucratic issues and the CIA torture, it's already happened. There's no changing it unless we completely kind of change the public narrative around how these issues are viewed and what our understanding of justice is. What is the United States' definition, of innocence for these men? If we continue to just call them terrorists over and over and over again, this is what living after Guantanamo means. It is just another Guantanamo. So what she points out specifically in this report that was of interest to me was highlighting Kazakhstan and the United Arab Emirates, where these abuses of detainees she found to be egregious. Now that's a powerful word for a UN paper to use. I don't think you can get much more serious than having an egregious concern. And so she wrote, in Kazakhstan, former detainees effectively remain under house arrest and are unable to live a normal and dignified life due to the secondary security measures put in place post-transfer. Now, again, what do we do about this situation? The State Department is saying, well, it's up to Kazakhstan to decide what the security measures are. Kazakhstan is responsible for them. And the special rapporteur disagrees essentially with that. She says, quote, there is a legal and moral obligation for the United States to use all of its diplomatic and legal resources to facilitate retransferring these men with meaningful assurance and support to the other countries. What this means is that she is saying these men need to be taken out of Kazakhstan, out of the United Arab Emirates, because they are being essentially tortured, held in arbitrary detention yet again. And it is morally imperative that the United States steps in and is involved. And in my reporting, I found that essentially the US government completely disagrees with this. From a legal standpoint, they say, no, we had a deal. The deal is over. Kazakhstan is in legal control of these men, and we want nothing to do with it. Diplomatically, this would be the moral obligation part.
Right, I got you.
Morally, they also say, no, that's not for us to decide the morality of what has happened with these men. I was told in a quote from the State Department, once security assurances have expired and pending any specific renegotiation of assurances, it falls largely to the discretion of the host country to determine, what security measures they continue to implement. There's really no, they're saying our hands are tied. We have no interest. This is not, oh, sure. On a personal level, I can say, this is terrible that this happened, but it's really not for us here at the State Department to deal with. And she says, no, absolutely. There is a legal and moral obligation. And so that's critical. I really haven't seen such a powerful call to action from the United States. This slammed the United States government. The UN really took us to task here for what has been done to these men at Guantanamo currently, and mostly, in the countries where they have been arbitrarily detained. She also found, that this report was significant in finding a much larger study, that had kind of been done for the first time, that she looked into so many different cases of where these detainees, have been sent. And she found what I'm saying is that, this is the first time where someone has looked into the enormity of the situation and interviewed so many former detainees that have been put out in the world, because really no one's really keeping track of that. And so she found, that the men released from Guantanamo and resettlement deals, in fact, had not been given proper legal status by their host countries in 30% of documented cases. And that's just documented cases. It's not, she wasn't able to interview all 700 people, who were here. And sorry, not all 700, of course, are in resettlement, host countries. However, hundreds are. And 30% is quite high. 30% is unacceptable.
And the problem with this whole report, in terms of how the problem for the United States, is this. Okay, you created the problem. You rounded people up under the pretense that they represent a threat to the security of the United States. You round them up. You take them to Guantanamo Bay. Then, after you've held them for up to 20 years or better or less, then you say, oh, you're no longer a threat. You're no longer a problem. You're no longer a security threat to the United States. But yet you don't have the humanity or you don't feel the moral obligation to say, oh, because what we did to you, now we're going to send you back to your country and compensate you. No. The way we're going to do, we're going to pass the buck. We're going to come to an agreement with the United Arab Emirates, Kazakhstan, and say that you take them off our hands, they're your responsibility. We'll pay you, but in terms of us having anything to do with them, we're no longer obligated, and we're not going to do anything with them. But as we close out, I just want to make this one observation. When 9/11 happened, I was serving time in the Maryland prison, since I did 48 years prior to being released. But during that time, I was in the Supermax when 9/11 happened, and I was on the walk, and I was looking at my cell, and I seen when the Twin Towers went down. I went to a person's cell, and I said, you know what? I said, the Twin Towers just went down. I said, the United States is going to find somebody to blame, and when they find somebody to blame, they're going to make sure that they do everything humanly possible to eradicate them as a people or eradicate them as human beings. And this is what they have did to Sabri. going forward, what do you want our listeners to know, and what do you really think should be the takeaway from this whole thing? How you think the American people should respond to this? What's going on with men like Sabri and others that's waiting, or others that's already in these kind of situations?
What needs to change in the thinking about Guantanamo is what we were just speaking about before, and something you just mentioned here. Why were these men not given reparations? Why were these men not rehabilitated or given compensation? Because we do not want to acknowledge that they are victims of torture and that we were wrong. There is a, confirmation bias, with these men that is persistent and is so, uniformly understood as the truth. And what I mean by confirmation bias is that we cannot begin to admit that we got the wrong people.
Right.
That these men were not responsible for 9/11. So, the trial, the Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and the accused for 9/11 are still at Guantanamo Bay. The trial has not even happened. We've been stuck in pretrial hearings. People in the United States don't know about this. They don't know that there is a military broken commission system where the military is the judge in these cases. Guantanamo has been a story in the news for 23 years now, and it's a story that people, think that they know and they're tired of. The overwhelming narrative is, that's where we sent the terrorists.
Right.
After 9/11, we got them. That's where all the bad guys went. And in reality, the unbelievable, fuck up that was Guantanamo is really not understood. People really do not. I mean, and there are people, who were working. Mark Fallon, who was one of the heads of the Naval Criminal Investigation Services, makes a great point of this, in his book Unjustifiable Means, and is somebody in the actual, many leading people in the military have been able to say, we made a lot of mistakes. These men were not supposed to be there. They were nobodies. They were not. It was not Osama bin Laden, at Guantanamo Bay. But that's very rare. That's very rare for people in the government to admit, we got this so terribly wrong. For Obama to have done what he did, where, he did not prosecute torture. He said, let's look forward, not backwards. That, we lost a pivotal moment there in understanding what was done post 9/11. They swept the torture under the rug. They allowed, this legal nightmare of overclassification and, lack of justice.
That's right.
For both the victims, the family members, the victims of 9/11 and other incidents, and the American public. There's been no justice done for us, for the victims of 9/11. There's been no justice for the maybe 1 million innocent Iraqis who were slaughtered in the aftermath of 9/11, having had nothing to do with it.
That's right.
There's been no justice for the bombing of Afghanistan, Libya, Somalia, the drone strikes in those countries, in Pakistan as well, and on and on and on. I mean, we have unleashed, Pandora's box of terrorism on other countries that did not deserve the Islamophobic, attacks and brutalization and murder outright of their people.
Elise, tell our audience, as we close out, tell our audience how they can get in touch with you, or how they can review some of your writings, or stay on abreast to what's, as you report these things. Because as you said, the media, the public is being desensitized by Guantanamo Bay, because that's the narrative that the fascists is pushing now. Terrorism and terrorists live there. If you got an attitude about that, then you support terrorism. So you should be happy that we got the terrorists isolated and taken care of. So to stop another 9/11, how can our people, our viewers and listeners, get stay abreast of what's going on?
I just got back actually from Guantanamo Bay. I was there on a reporting trip, and I will have some stories coming out soon at theintercept.com. I have a staff page there. If you just simply Google, Elise Swain, The Intercept, you can see all of the reporting and writing that I've done right there on my staff page. I am on Twitter. I am on Instagram. I would say check back in at the Intercept, because I have some great stories coming up.
Okay, there you have it. Elise Swain, Rattling the Bars. When we say close Guantanamo Bay, we always think about what we're gonna do with the people that's there, and that's give us consternation about closing, because we're saying that if we close it, this is a narrative that's being perpetuated by the government and fascists. If we close it, then we have to do something with the terrorists, and therefore that's why it's not being closed. No, when we say close Guantanamo Bay, we saying close it because, as Elise Swain just put out, these are innocent people that's being held there. This was just rounded up the same way they rounded up people and put them in Japanese internment camps, the same way they rounded people up and put them in Auschwitz, Bakwa, and Dhaka, the same way they rounded up people in Africa and brought them over here as slaves. This is the human tragedy. The human tragedy of Guantanamo Bay is that they're terrorizing people, and they turning, as a result of the terrorism on them, then they send them to countries that they don't have no rights and don't have no way of re-socializing themselves. We ask that you continue to support the Real News and Rattling the Bars, because it's the only way you're going to get an Elise Swain that's going to tell you about Guantanamo Bay and give you the real news behind it. Because guess what? We are actually the real news. Thank you, Elise. We appreciate it, and continue your good work.
Thank you so much. Solidarity, my friend.
Thank you so much for watching the Real News Network, where we lift up the voices, stories, and struggles that you care about most. And we need your help to keep doing this work. So please, tap your screen now, subscribe, and donate to the Real News Network. Solidarity forever.